Imagine that moment. You open your investment app, look at your retirement fund or your stocks, and all you see is a sea of red. The numbers are no longer just lifeless data. They represent your sweat, your long days of labor, your hopes for the future, all vanishing right before your eyes. That feeling, the fear of losing everything, doesn't belong to any single generation. It has haunted humanity for hundreds of years under a single name: financial crisis. History has marked those dark days. In October 1929, desperate Wall Street traders held their heads in their hands as the market went into freefall. 2 centuries earlier, all of Europe went mad for tulip bulbs, only to have their fantasies shattered overnight. In the early 2000s, the internet dream turned into the dot-com bubble. And in 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed, unleashing a seismic shock that caused millions to lose their homes and jobs. The context may differ, the numbers may change, but the song remains the same. Every time we tell ourselves this will never happen again, the waves of greed and fear rise once more, sweeping away even the most fragile beliefs. Welcome back to Sleepless Mind. Tonight, we won't be sitting in front of dry balance sheets. Instead, we will follow the stories. Stories about people, about instincts, about greed, fear, and our own self-delusion. The big question that will guide us tonight is, why does history repeat itself? And why after every collapse do we still plant the seeds for the next crisis? On this journey, we will walk past the tulips of Holland, stop at Wall Street in 1929, witness Asia tremble in 1997, and navigate the global crisis of 2008. Each time, the world changed, but it seems people stayed the same. If you're ready for a long, sleepless night with financial history, press the subscribe button for Sleepless Mind so you don't miss the stories that lie ahead. And before we begin, I want to ask you something. Has a single red number on your phone screen ever made your heart feel heavy?
Anatomy of the storm. When trust is worth zero. In the introduction, we touched upon a very primal feeling. The panic of watching the fruits of your labor vanish on a phone screen. That feeling, though wrapped in modern terms like market correction or economic recession, is in fact a fear that has existed for centuries. But to truly understand it, we must ask a more fundamental question. What exactly is a financial crisis? Where does it begin? Is it because the world suddenly runs out of money? The answer, surprisingly, is no. In most crises, money doesn't disappear. The buildings are still standing, the factories are still there, the roads still exist. What has truly evaporated, the priceless and intangible asset that has collapsed, is the very foundation of our entire modern civilization. It is trust. The entire complex financial system we operate in every day, from the dollar bill you use to buy a cup of coffee to the instantaneous multi-trillion-dollar transactions between banks, is all built on a silent promise, a collective belief. It's like a skyscraper made entirely of glass. When the sun shines, it sparkles and looks magnificent, a symbol of human prosperity and talent. But the nature of glass is that it is brittle and fragile, and just one small crack in a place no one expects is enough to create a chain reaction that can cause the entire grand structure to shatter into a million pieces. In this part of our journey, we will not just look at the broken pieces. We will become investigators, tracing the origins of the very first cracks. We will dissect the concept of trust in finance and witness how fragile it is through one of the most dramatic stories in American financial history. Before we go any further, we need to pause for a moment and look at the most familiar object in our pockets, a dollar bill. Have you ever truly contemplated it? Why can this piece of cotton and linen paper bearing the image of a deceased president be exchanged for a meal, a tank of gas, or a month's rent? It has no intrinsic value in itself. You can't eat it, you can't use it for shelter from the rain. So where does its value come from? The answer is simple, yet profound. Its value comes from the fact that we all agree it has value. The dollar bill is a product of collective imagination, a form of an invisible social contract. The history of money is a long journey from bartering to using items with intrinsic value like gold and silver, and finally, to today's fiat money, currency that has value simply because the government declares it so. Let's try a thought experiment. If tomorrow all 330 million people in America suddenly woke up and collectively believed that seashells were the legal currency, the dollar bill in your wallet would instantly become worthless, would revert to its true nature, a piece of printed paper. Money, in a sense, is very much like a language. The word tree has no intrinsic connection to an actual tree in the real world. It is just a collection of sounds that billions of English speakers have agreed to use to refer to that object. If we all agreed to call it a blorg, then blorg would become the word for a tree. A financial crisis occurs when we begin to lose faith in the grammar and vocabulary of the language of money. People start to doubt, will this dollar bill still buy a loaf of bread tomorrow? Is the number in my bank account really money? When millions of people ask that same question, the system begins to tremble. Trust, the most important and invisible currency, starts to run out. To see how this evaporation of trust plays out in reality, let's turn to one of the most frightening and dramatic phenomena of any crisis: a bank run. Let's paint a picture. Imagine a small, fictional town in the American Midwest around the early 20th century. Let's call it Prosperity Falls. This town has a single bank, the First Trust Bank, run by Mr. Abernathy, an elderly man with a silver mustache and a reassuring smile. Everyone in town deposits their life savings there. Sarah, the school teacher, is saving up to buy a small house. The Millers, a farming family, deposit their harvest earnings each season. Mr. Abernathy, like any other banker, doesn't keep all that money in the vault. He uses it to lend to local businesses and to families buying land. That's how the economy works. Everything is based on one implicit assumption: not everyone will come to withdraw their money at the same time. But then one day, a rumor starts. Perhaps it came from a misunderstood telegram or a newspaper clipping about a bank in trouble in a distant city. The rumor whispers through the general store and the barbershop, "I heard the First Trust Bank made a bad investment. They might be running out of money." This rumor could be completely false. But in the world of trust, perception is more important than reality. Thomas the blacksmith, a naturally cautious man, hears the rumor. He tells himself, "It's probably nothing but better safe than sorry." He goes to the bank and quietly withdraws all of his savings. Sarah, the school teacher, on her way to work, happens to see Thomas leaving the bank with a worried look on his face. Her heart begins to beat faster. Thomas is withdrawing his money. Something must be wrong. She hurries in after him. Their actions do not go unnoticed. Like a small pebble starting an avalanche, fear spreads faster than a plague. Within an hour, a long line has formed outside the First Trust Bank, every face etched with anxiety. They are no longer friendly neighbors. They are desperate individuals fighting to reclaim what is theirs. Mr. Abernathy comes out, trying to calm the crowd. "Please be calm. Everyone's money is safe." But his words are drowned out by the sea of panic. Crowd pushes, shouts, demanding their money immediately. Of course, the bank does not have enough cash on hand to satisfy everyone at once. When the bank is forced to close its doors because it has run out of cash, the prophecy has fulfilled itself. The fear of the bank failing has officially made the bank fail. Trust is dead, and with it, the savings of an entire town. The parable of Prosperity Falls is a miniature version of what happens on a global scale. Today, instead of lines of people on the street, we have electronic transfers worth billions of dollars executed in a millisecond. But the core dynamic remains unchanged: the fear that someone else knows something you don't, and you must act before it's too late. The parable above is not a product of fiction. It has happened time and time again in American history, especially during the Gilded Age, a period of extreme wealth and giant tycoons, but also an era without regulation and without a safety net. The American financial system back then was like the Wild West, and no event illustrates that chaos and fragility more clearly than the panic of 1907. To understand this crisis, we must understand the context. America in the early 20th century was a rising industrial power, but its financial system was dangerously lagging. There was no central bank like the Federal Reserve that we know today. This meant there was no lender of last resort to intervene when banks got into trouble. Each bank was an island, and when the storm came, it had to fend for itself. In the autumn of 1907, a few daring speculators lit the fuse for the storm. F. Augustus Hines, known as the Copper King, along with his partner Charles W. Morse, attempted a risky scheme to corner the market for shares of the United Copper Company. Their plan was to buy up a massive amount of stock, drive the price sky high, and then force short sellers to buy back at exorbitant prices. The plan failed spectacularly. They didn't have enough capital to complete the corner, and when the scheme unraveled, the price of United Copper stock plummeted. From $62 to just $10 in a single day, Hines and Morse were ruined. In a healthy financial system, the collapse of a few reckless speculators might have been just a small ripple. But in 1907, it was the boulder that started a landslide. The problem was that Hines and Morse were closely tied to a chain of banks and trust companies. When they fell, the financial institutions associated with them immediately came under suspicion. The dominoes began to fall. The State Savings Bank in Montana, linked to Hines, was the first to face a bank run. The news quickly spread to New York. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the city's largest and most prestigious institutions, was rumored to be involved. Immediately, a sea of people surrounded Knickerbocker's magnificent headquarters, demanding to withdraw their money. In a matter of hours, Knickerbocker paid out $8 million before running out of cash and being forced to close. The fall of the Knickerbocker delivered a fatal blow to public confidence. Panic spread like wildfire. A giant like Knickerbocker could fall. Where was safe? Bank runs erupted across the city. The New York Stock Exchange teetered, and overnight lending rates skyrocketed. The world's largest economy was on the brink of collapse. At that time, the government was almost powerless. There was no mechanism to respond. And so, all of Wall Street and Washington had to turn to one man, an individual with the power of a king, John Pierpont Morgan, or J.P. Morgan. Morgan, then in his 70s, was attending a church convention in Richmond, Virginia. When he heard news of the chaos, he immediately returned to New York. He found the financial city he dominated engulfed in the flames of fear. He knew that if he didn't act, the entire American economic structure he had helped build would collapse. Morgan decided to become America's one-man central bank. He did something legendary. Summoned dozens of New York's top bankers to the magnificent marble library of his Madison Avenue mansion. In the room filled with priceless manuscripts and works of art, Morgan laid out the situation. He told them that individual selfishness had to be set aside, had to pool their resources to rescue the struggling banks and trust companies, to restore confidence. Many hesitated. They didn't want to use their good money to save their weaker rivals. Seeing this, Morgan made a bold decision. He locked the library doors and declared, "This is the place we will stay until I have my answer." Held captive by a man no one dared to defy, the bankers reluctantly agreed. Throughout the night, Morgan and his team worked without sleep, examining the books of troubled companies, deciding who deserved to be saved and who had to fall. He committed a large portion of his own vast fortune as an example. After several tense days, thanks to J.P. Morgan's ruthless and decisive intervention, the panic was finally brought under control. He had single-handedly saved the American financial system. The story doesn't end there. The panic of 1907 was a wake-up call. Everyone, from politicians to financiers, realized a frightening truth. The economy of a great nation could not depend on the compassion or decisiveness of a single individual, no matter how powerful he was. There needed to be a system, a permanent institution to perform that role. It was from the ashes of 1907 that serious discussions began, ultimately leading to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, forever changing the face of American finance. Thus, we see that a financial crisis is not a supernatural phenomenon. It is not a storm that comes from nowhere. It is a storm of confidence, born from the very psychological fabric of human beings and the fragility of the systems we create. The financial system, no matter how much it is reinforced by regulations, always has a ghost in the machine. The unpredictable interplay between trust and fear. We've just seen how fragile the system can be and how a small crack can spread. But the important question remains: what creates those cracks in the first place? If the collapse is caused by fear, then what built a tower so high that it could collapse? The answer lies in the emotion opposite of fear, an emotion far more powerful and seductive. In the next part, we will dissect the most powerful force in the world. We will explore how it combines with herd psychology to create the most insane asset bubbles in history, from tulip bulbs to worthless stocks. Don't forget to like the video if you find these deep insights valuable. And here is a question for you to ponder. In your opinion, between greed and fear, which emotion is more destructive in the financial markets? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The root of sin, when greed exceeds reason. In the previous part, we discovered a startling truth. The financial system, however solid it may seem, is actually as fragile as a glass castle, held together by one thing only: trust. Collapse of trust, ignited by fear, can level an entire economy. But that raises an even bigger question. Why was the castle built so high that it could collapse in the first place? Fear can only destroy what has already been built. So who or what were the architects who designed these magnificent yet risky structures? The answer doesn't lie in a single individual or conspiracy. It lies deep within our own psychology and systems. In this part, we will dissect the four horsemen of the apocalypse of a financial crisis, for factors that are almost always present before every collapse. They are the architects of destruction: asset bubbles, financial leverage, herd psychology, and lax regulation. To understand them, we will travel back in time to two of the most insane and deeply cautionary tales in history. The first and most recognizable horseman is the asset bubble. A bubble forms when the price of an asset, be it stocks, real estate, or even tulip bulbs, no longer reflects its intrinsic value. Instead, the price is driven by a blind and spreading belief that its price will continue to rise forever. People buy not because they need the asset, but simply because they believe they can sell it to someone else for a higher price tomorrow. It's a dangerous game of hot potato, and it always ends in tears. And no story illustrates this madness more clearly than the first and most bizarre recorded financial bubble in history. The Tulip Mania in the Netherlands in the 17th century. Imagine the scene. The Netherlands in the 1630s. This is their golden age. Amsterdam is the commercial hub of the world. Dutch ships bring back wealth from all corners of the globe. A new wealthy merchant class has emerged, and they want to show off their riches. At that time, the tulip, introduced from the Ottoman Empire, was a luxury item, new and incredibly captivating. Owning a rare tulip was like owning a limited edition supercar today. It was an absolute symbol of status. Initially, trading was confined to wealthy gardeners and the nobility. But gradually, stories of enormous profits began to spread. A neighbor buys a tulip bulb for 100 guilders and sells it for 1,000 guilders just a few months later. That news spread faster than the plague. Soon, everyone was swept up in it. Weavers, farmers, maids, they all sold their most valuable possessions: land, houses, livestock, to buy inanimate flower bulbs. The tulip market moved from gardens into taverns, where people shouted, traded, and got drunk on the fantasy of getting rich quick. The madness peaked in the winter of 1636 to 1637. The price of a rare tulip bulb, like the Semper Augustus, could be traded for a luxurious canal-side mansion in Amsterdam. There are records of a single tulip bulb being exchanged for tons of wheat, butter, livestock, and even a ship. There is a famous story about a sailor who, mistaking a precious tulip bulb for an onion, casually ate it with his lunch, only to be thrown in prison for consuming an asset worth an entire crew's lifetime wages. People traded futures contracts for bulbs that hadn't even sprouted. They were trading on an idea, a dream. But then, like every other bubble, it had to burst. In February 1637, at an auction in Haarlem, for the first time, no one bid higher for a lot of tulips. A terrifying silence fell over the room. The news spread. A hint of doubt crept into the system, and that was all it took. Like a chain reaction, everyone tried to sell off their stock. But now, no one wanted to buy. Prices plummeted. Within weeks, an asset once worth a mansion was now worth no more than a common onion. Thousands went bankrupt. The Dutch economy sank into recession. What is the lesson from Tulip Mania? It wasn't about the flowers. It is a fable about human nature. It proves that when dominated by greed and collective delusion, humans can create value from nothing, and can also watch it vanish into thin air in the blink of an eye. If the asset bubble is the disease, then the second horseman, financial leverage, is what makes that disease fatal. Leverage, simply put, is using borrowed money to amplify potential returns. It is an extremely powerful tool, a double-edged sword. Let's use an example very familiar to Americans. Buying a house. Suppose you want to buy a house worth $500,000. You have $50,000 in savings for a down payment. The bank lends you the remaining $450,000. In this case, you are using 10-to-1 leverage. Let's see its power. A year later, the real estate market booms and your house is valued at $550,000. Its value has increased by $50,000. For your initial $50,000 investment, that's a 100% return. You feel like a financial genius. That is the sweet edge of the leveraged sword. But what about the other edge? Suppose the market goes down and your house is now only worth $450,000. You still owe the bank $450,000. That means your $50,000 of equity has been completely wiped out. You've lost 100% of your investment. Worse, if the house price drops to $400,000, not only have you lost all your money, but you now owe the bank more than the house is worth. You are underwater. That is the cruel edge of the leveraged sword. Now, imagine the investment banks and hedge funds on Wall Street. They don't use 10-to-1 leverage. They might use 20-to-1, 30-to-1, or even higher. They are playing a game with enormous sums of money, amplified by enormous debts. In good times, the profits are astronomical. But when the market dips just a little, their entire capital can be wiped out instantly. Leverage is the gasoline poured on the fire of speculation. It doesn't create the bubble, but it ensures that when the bubble bursts, the explosion will be massive. So we have a bubble and we have the fuel of debt. But what makes millions of people pour gasoline on the fire at the same time? That's when the third horseman appears. Herd psychology. Humans are social creatures. We have a tendency to believe that if everyone else is doing something, it must be the right thing to do. An investor's biggest fear is not losing money, but watching their friends and neighbors get rich while they sit on the sidelines. That feeling is known today as FOMO. And no one illustrates the destructive power of herd psychology, even on the greatest of minds, better than Sir Isaac Newton and the story of the South Sea bubble. The setting is England in the early 18th century. The government is deep in debt after years of war. The South Sea Company came with an attractive proposal. They would take over the entire government debt, and in return, they would be granted a monopoly on trade with the rich Spanish colonies in South America. It was a fantastic story. The only problem was, that trade was virtually non-existent. Spain and England were still in a state of tension, and the South Sea Company was only allowed to send one ship per year. Eventually, the company had no real business operations. But that didn't stop the euphoria. Fueled by rumors and promotion from politicians who had shares in the company, the price of South Sea stock began to soar. All of England was caught in the frenzy. From dukes to maids, everyone poured their savings into South Sea stock. Hundreds of other bubble companies sprang up like mushrooms, offering the most absurd ideas. One company even raised capital for a business of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Sir Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics, one of the most logical and rational minds in human history, was not immune. Initially, he invested wisely, buying early and selling for a 100% profit, about £7,000, a fortune at the time. But then, he made a classic mistake. He stood on the sidelines and watched the market continue to rise maniacally. He saw his less intelligent friends and colleagues getting rich quickly. The feeling of being left out became unbearable. Dominated by herd psychology, he jumped back into the market, pouring his entire fortune into South Sea stock right at the peak of the bubble. A few months later, the bubble burst. The stock crashed. Sir Isaac Newton lost over 20,000 pounds, an amount equivalent to millions of dollars today. This loss embittered him so much that he later forbade anyone from mentioning the word South Sea in his presence. And it was he who left behind an immortal quote. A bitter confession about the limits of reason against the power of collective emotion. I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. If even Isaac Newton could be defeated by herd psychology, what hope do we ordinary people have? The first three horsemen are rooted in human psychology, but they can only run rampant when the fourth horseman clears the way. Weak lacks regulation. Imagine the government and regulatory agencies as the parents. The banks and financial institutions are the teenagers. Greed and speculation are like a house party. The parents are home setting clear rules: no drinking, no loud music, clean up by 11 p.m. The party can be fun and under control. But when the parents leave the house and say, "Help yourselves, just be responsible," disaster is imminent. The party will get wild, property will be destroyed, and eventually the parents will have to come back to clean up the mess. In financial history, nearly every major crisis has occurred after a period where regulations were repealed or supervision was loosened. Politicians and economists believed in the mantra that the free market could regulate itself. They let the teenagers play freely with increasingly complex and dangerous financial instruments like leverage. The result is always a spectacular party followed by a terrible hangover for all of society. So there we have them, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. A bubble inflated by irrational hope, fueled by the debt of leverage, driven by the engine of herd psychology, and allowed to exist by the absence of strict regulations. These four elements create an almost perfect recipe for disaster. It shows us a fundamental truth that humanity seems to have to relearn every generation. People always dream of getting rich quick, but they forget that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Every bubble is built on the illusion that this time is different. But human nature, with its greed and fear, is never different. We have all the ingredients: the bubble, the debt, the madness of the crowd, and a bit of negligence from the adults. Now let's go to the 1920s in America, where all these ingredients were thrown into a giant pressure cooker and created the most terrifying explosion in modern history. Part 3. The Great Depression of 1929, when the American dream became a nightmare. A question for you in this part. Have you ever bought something just because you saw everyone around you rushing into it? Share your experience in the comments. The Great Depression of 1929, when the American dream became a nightmare, we just left the laboratory, where we identified the four toxic ingredients: asset bubbles, financial leverage, herd psychology, and lax regulation. Now let's go to America in the 1920s, where all those ingredients not only existed but were celebrated as symbols of a golden era. The 1920s in America, also known as the Roaring Twenties, was the biggest party in history. World War I was over, Europe was exhausted, and America emerged as an undisputed creditor and industrial powerhouse. Optimism was everywhere. Factories mass-produced cars, radios, and refrigerators. Women cut their hair short, wore short skirts, and danced the Charleston in jazz clubs. It was an era of dizzying change, of liberation, and above all, of an ironclad belief in perpetual prosperity. And the heart of that party was Wall Street. The stock market was no longer just the playground of the financial elite. It had become a national obsession. Millions of ordinary Americans, teachers, factory workers, secretaries poured their life savings into the market. There's a famous story that you could get stock tips from your shoeshine boy. The stock market had become the ultimate embodiment of the American dream. a place where anyone, regardless of their background, could get rich overnight. But no one realized they were dancing on the edge of an erupting volcano. The party on Wall Street was fueled by a potent cocktail, and its main ingredient was leverage, under the charming name of buying on margin. The mechanism was incredibly seductive. You didn't need $1,000 to buy $1,000 worth of stock. You just needed to put down 10% or $100, and your broker would happily lend you the remaining $900. This created a magical effect. If the stock price rose to $1,100, you made $100 on your investment of just $100. That's a 100% return. Who wouldn't want to play a game like that? Everyone rushed to borrow money to buy stocks. Total margin debt soared from under $4 billion in mid-1927 to $8.5 billion by September 1929. The entire market was built on a massive mountain of debt. It amplified profits on the way up, but it also set a ticking time bomb for the way down. Alongside this was the explosion of investment trusts. These were the early, unregulated versions of today's mutual funds. These trusts raised money from the public to buy stocks of other companies. But more dangerously, they also used leverage, borrowing money to buy more stock, even bought shares in each other, creating a tangled structure, a house of cards within another house of cards. A gentle breeze could bring it all down. All this madness was justified by a fashionable economic philosophy, the New Era philosophy. Many leading economists, politicians, and business leaders confidently declared that America had entered a new era where the old rules of the business cycle no longer applied. They believed that technological innovation and the genius of Wall Street leaders had created a permanently high plateau of prosperity. Irving Fisher, one of the most famous economists of the time, declared just days before the crash, "Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau." This was the herd psychology and lax regulation we talked about in part 2, but on a national scale. No one wanted to be the only one not at the party. The government, under President Calvin Coolidge, was happy to let the party go on without any supervision. The summer of 1929 was the peak of euphoria. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had nearly doubled in just a year and a half. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to appear. Industrial production was stagnating. Construction industry was in decline. But the stock market, detached from reality, continued to climb. Then came October. The nightmare began slowly on Black Thursday, October 24th. From the moment the opening bell rang, an unprecedented wave of selling hit. There was no single clear reason. It was simply that after a long bull run, the number of sellers suddenly outnumbered the buyers. Panic began to spread. The ticker tapes ran an hour and a half behind actual trading, leaving investors in the dark about what was happening. All they knew was that they were losing money fast. At noon, a glimmer of hope appeared. Richard Whitney, the vice president of the New York Stock Exchange and a representative of a powerful group of bankers, confidently strode onto the trading floor. He walked to the U.S. Steel Trading Post and placed a large buy order at a price above the market. It was a staged act to show confidence. That action, along with other banks pumping in money, temporarily halted the slide. The market rallied and closed with only a slight loss. Over the weekend, many breathed a sigh of relief, believing the worst was over. They were wrong. On Black Monday, October 28th, the weekend's calm vanished. News of Thursday's chaos had spread across the country, and thousands of small investors decided they had to get out at any cost. The wave of selling returned, this time even more ferocious. The Dow Jones fell by 13%. The powerful bankers, realizing they couldn't fight a tsunami, decided not to intervene again. And then came Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the day the financial world collapsed. It was a complete surrender. From the opening bell, a flood of sell orders inundated the market. People sold at any price. It just wanted out. 16.4 million shares were traded, a record that stood for 40 years. Investors stood crowded outside Wall Street, silently watching the disastrous numbers appear on the electronic board. Fortunes built over a decade were wiped out in a matter of hours. That day, the market lost another 12%. By the end of the day, The silence that fell over Wall Street was not one of relief, but of shock and despair. The party was over. The stock market crash was a disaster in itself, but it did not cause the Great Depression. It was merely the match that lit a powder keg that had long been prepared. The real collapse came from the devastating domino effect that followed. First came the margin calls. The brokers who had lent 90% of the money for stock purchases now demanded that investors repay those loans immediately. But the investors were broke. They were forced to sell everything they had left, driving stock prices down even further. Next, and most fatally, was the collapse of the banking system. During the 1920s, banks had not only lent money for stock speculation, but had also directly used customer deposits to invest in the market. When the market crashed, these banks suffered massive losses. People, fearing their banks would fail, rushed to withdraw their money, the very bank run phenomenon we discussed. And that fear became reality. From 1930 to 1933, over 9,000 banks in the U.S. failed, taking with them the life savings of millions of families. When the banks collapsed, credit for the economy froze. Businesses couldn't borrow money to operate. People having lost their savings stopped shopping. Factories couldn't sell their goods and were forced to lay off workers. This led to a death spiral. Rising unemployment, greater than decreased purchasing power. More business failures, greater than even higher unemployment. By 1933, the unemployment rate in the U.S. reached 25%. 1 in 4 working-age people was jobless. Human cost was immeasurable. Shantytowns, ironically called Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, sprang up everywhere. Long lines of the unemployed waited for a piece of bread or a bowl of soup from charity. In rural areas, a horrific drought created the Dust Bowl, turning fertile fields into deserts and forcing hundreds of thousands of families to migrate. Faced with extreme desperation, a wave of suicides occurred across the country. The tragedy did not stop at America's borders. As the world's largest creditor, the U.S. began to call in its loans from Europe. Worse, in 1930, the U.S. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising tariffs on imported goods to record levels. The aim was to protect domestic industries, but the result was that it choked off international trade. Other countries retaliated by raising their own tariffs. Global trade collapsed, dragging the entire world into the spiral of depression. America's Great Depression had become the world's Great Depression. The Great Depression was one of the darkest chapters in American history. But from its ashes, important and lasting lessons were learned. The biggest lesson was the failure of the idea that the market could regulate itself. The crisis proved that when left to its own devices, capitalism has a capacity for self-destruction. This paved the way for a revolutionary philosophical shift. Government intervention is necessary to save and stabilize the economy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policy was the embodiment of this philosophy, with a series of job creation programs and sweeping reforms. These reforms reshaped American finance forever. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was established in 1933. The government now insured people's bank deposits, guaranteeing that if a bank failed, they would not lose their life savings. This was a direct antidote to bank runs. The Glass-Steagall Act created a firewall between commercial banking and investment banking. To prevent banks from using people's money for risky speculation, the Securities and Exchange Commission was created to regulate the stock market, enforce rules on transparency, and fight fraud. The role of the central bank was also re-examined. The Fed's failure to act as a lender of last resort to save the banks was widely criticized. Reinforcing the importance of this role in future crises, 1929 was a slap in the face that woke up the world, forcing everyone to admit a harsh truth: the free market, for all its creative power, cannot heal the wounds it inflicts upon itself. It took America and the world more than a decade and a World War II fully escape the shadow of the Great Depression. It seemed the lesson was so clear, the pain so deep, that it could never be repeated. But then, a few decades later, on the other side of the globe, a new generation, drunk on their own success, started an even grander party and once again forgot the old rules. In the next part, we will travel to Asia in the 1990s to witness the economic miracle turn into tragedy as the dragons fell during the 1997 Asian financial crisis. A question for you after this part. What are your thoughts on the role of government? Should the market be left to operate completely freely, or is strong intervention needed to prevent crises? Leave your opinion. The 1997 Asian crisis, when dragons fell to earth, the world after 1929 had changed. The lessons of the Great Depression led to the establishment of a new global economic order. With stricter regulations and a system designed to prevent total collapse, for decades, that system, while not perfect, maintained relative stability. But by the end of the 20th century, a powerful wave of globalization and a new era of free capital flows began to reshape the world. And nowhere embraced this wave more enthusiastically and spectacularly than in East and Southeast Asia. The late 1980s and early 1990s were an extraordinary time for the region. While Western economies were content with a few percent growth per year, countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and especially South Korea were booming at an unbelievable rate. They were admired by the world and called by a proud name, the Asian Dragons. It was a true economic miracle. In just one generation, countries that were once poor agricultural societies transformed into dynamic industrial and financial hubs. Paddy fields gave way to microchip factories. Once quiet cities sprouted glittering skyscrapers. The energy in Bangkok, Seoul, or Kuala Lumpur was palpable. A boundless optimism spread, a belief that Asia was rising to claim its rightful place on the world stage. Billions of dollars in investment capital poured in from around the world, seeking to profit from this miracle. But no one realized that the foundation of that miracle was built on a deadly geological fault line. To understand why the mighty dragons could fall so quickly, we need to understand the original sin of their economic model. This is a seemingly complex issue, but it's very simple at its core. At the time, interest rates in the US and Japan were low. International investors and banks had vast amounts of capital, but couldn't find profitable places to put it. They looked to Asia, where economies were growing at double-digit rates, and saw a golden opportunity. They began lending hundreds of billions of dollars to Asian companies and banks. Asian businesses eagerly welcomed this flood of capital. They did something that seemed very smart at the time. They borrowed money in US dollars because the interest rates were very low. They used those dollars, converted them into local currencies, and invested massively in domestic projects, building office towers, luxury resorts, expanding factories, and speculating in the booming stock and real estate markets. Everything seemed perfect. But behind it was a colossal gamble, a fateful bet. For this model to work, one crucial condition had to be met. The exchange rate between the US dollar and the local currency had to remain stable. To ensure this, Asian governments adopted a policy of pegging their currencies to the dollar. For example, the Thai government pledged to always maintain the exchange rate at around 25 baht to $1. This created a false sense of security, encouraging even more borrowing in dollars. Let's try to visualize this gamble with a personal example. Suppose you are an American and you borrow 100,000 euros at a low interest rate to build a rental property in Texas. All your rental income is in dollars. You are betting that the exchange rate between the dollar and the euro will not change much. But what happens if the dollar suddenly loses half its value against the euro? Your dollar income remains the same, but your 100,000 euro debt, when converted to dollars, has suddenly doubled. You would go bankrupt. That is exactly the trap Asian countries had set for themselves, but on a scale of hundreds of billions of dollars. They had created a deadly currency mismatch. Their debts were in foreign currency, but their assets and income were in local currency. The time bomb was set. It was just waiting for someone to light the fuse. The fuse was lit in Thailand. In the mid-90s, Thailand was one of the most classic success stories, but also the weakest link. The inflow of foreign capital had inflated a massive real estate and stock market bubble in Bangkok. Empty office buildings sprouted up everywhere. The nation's foreign debt soared. International hedge funds, most famously George Soros's Quantum Fund, noticed this. They saw that the Thai baht was overvalued compared to fundamentals, and that the Bank of Thailand was running out of dollar reserves to defend its peg. They began a large-scale attack, short-selling the baht. They borrowed billions of baht, immediately converted them to dollars, believing that when the baht collapsed, they could buy back baht much more cheaply to repay the loan and profit from the difference. The Bank of Thailand fought desperately, spent tens of billions of dollars from its precious foreign exchange reserves to buy up baht, trying to hold the exchange rate. Why they could not fight the entire global market was like trying to stop a tsunami with a sandcastle. Finally, on July 2nd, 1997, the Thai government was forced to surrender. They announced they would float the baht, abandoning the peg. Immediately, the baht depreciated catastrophically. The gamble was over. The bomb had exploded. The explosion in Thailand sent a shockwave across the region. International investors, in a panic, began pulling their capital out of all economies with a similar structure. Herd mentality once again displayed its destructive power. If Thailand could fall, so could Indonesia, Malaysia, or the Philippines. The domino effect began. The Philippine peso, the Malaysian ringgit, and especially the Indonesian rupiah, all plummeted. Companies that had proudly boasted of billion-dollar projects suddenly saw their debts double or triple overnight. They couldn't repay their loans. The banks that had lent to them collapsed in turn. The entire economy fell into paralysis. But the biggest shock came when the storm reached South Korea. South Korea, the world's 11th largest economy. A true dragon with giant tech and industrial conglomerates like Samsung and Hyundai, seemed invulnerable. But beneath the surface, the giant family-owned conglomerates, known as chaebol, had also borrowed recklessly in foreign currency to expand. When the South Korean won collapsed, these giants also fell to their knees. South Korea, the pride of Asia, was on the brink of sovereign default. The miracle had officially become a tragedy. As nations stood on the verge of bankruptcy, there was only one organization in the world with the resources to intervene: the International Monetary Fund. The IMF acted as the lender of last resort for nations, providing emergency financial rescue packages worth tens of billions of dollars to Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea. But this help came at a very high price. The IMF forced the recipient countries to adhere to a series of harsh conditions, collectively known as austerity policies. These conditions included raising interest rates to very high levels to stabilize the local currency, drastically cutting government spending, closing down weak banks and companies, opening up the economy to foreign investors. The IMF's goal was to restructure the economies and restore market confidence. But for ordinary people, these policies were poison. High interest rates and budget cuts pushed already weakened economies into an even deeper recession. Millions lost their jobs. Poverty rates soared. Social unrest and violent protests erupted in Jakarta and Seoul. For many Asians, the IMF was not a savior. They were seen as a new colonial power, imposing harsh economic policies, forcing them to sell off national assets cheaply to Western corporations and stripping them of their economic sovereignty. Nowhere was the humiliation of the crisis, and the IMF's intervention felt more deeply than in South Korea. For a nation that had risen from the ashes of war to become an economic powerhouse, having to accept a bailout from the IMF was considered a national disgrace. And it was in this darkest hour that one of the most inspiring and moving stories of patriotism took place. A spontaneous movement arose across the country: the Gold Collection Campaign. It was an extraordinary sight. TV stars and celebrities removed their gold lapel pins live on air to donate. Athletes donated their precious Olympic medals. Young couples brought their wedding rings, their most sacred keepsakes, to collection points. Millions of ordinary South Koreans, from the elderly to the young, stood in line in the biting winter cold, patiently waiting for their turn to donate their family's gold jewelry, heirlooms, saved for generations, to the government, hoping to help the country pay back its IMF debt and regain its national pride. Within a few months, the people of South Korea had donated nearly 227 tons of gold, worth about $2.2 billion. It wasn't enough to pay off the entire debt, but it was a powerful symbol. It showed that a nation, when pushed to the brink, could unite with incredible sacrifice and self-respect. It was not just an economic act, it was an act to reclaim their identity and sovereignty. The 1997 Asian financial crisis was a traumatic experience, but it also offered invaluable lessons. The most important lesson, as Asian policymakers themselves acknowledged, is that economic development must be based on internal strength and cannot be forever dependent on hot, short-term, and volatile foreign capital flows. It exposed weaknesses in the financial system, a lack of transparency in corporate governance, and the dangers of a rigid exchange rate peg. The crisis was a brutal rite of passage for Asia. It forced countries to reform, build stronger financial systems, and accumulate massive foreign exchange reserves, so they would never have to bow to the IMF again. But while Asia was busy healing its wounds and learning its expensive lessons, on the other side of the world, at the very center of the global financial system, a new generation of financial wizards on Wall Street was ignoring all the warnings. They were creating financial instruments more complex and dangerous than anything the world had ever seen. Inflating a new bubble, a monster that would soon threaten to engulf not just a region, but the entire planet. In the next part, we'll return to the United States to confront that monster. The 2008 global financial crisis. The day Wall Street sold out the world. A question for you after this part. Can national pride help a country overcome an economic crisis? What does South Korea's story make you reflect on? The 2008 financial crisis. When Wall Street sold out the world entered the 21st century with a major scar. The dot-com bubble had burst, and the September 11th terrorist attacks had shaken America and the entire world. To fight the recession and fear, the U.S. Federal Reserve, under the leadership of Alan Greenspan, did the one thing it could. It cut interest rates to historic lows. This action was like turning on a giant fire hose and pumping money into the economy. Cheap money was everywhere. Investors, from giant pension funds to ordinary savers, could no longer make a profit from safe havens like government bonds. They became hungry for yield, willing to take on more risk. Cheap money needed to find a place to shelter and grow. And it found a perfect home. The U.S. real estate market. The dream of homeownership is a core part of American culture. And now, with cheap money and encouragement from the government, that dream seemed within reach for everyone. House prices started to rise, then they rose faster. And then they rose at a breakneck pace. A massive real estate bubble began to form. But the 2008 crisis was not just a simple real estate bubble. It was different from the Tulip Mania or the South Sea bubble. This time, greed did not show its naked face. It was cloaked in sophistication, in science, in complex mathematical formulas that only the geniuses on Wall Street could understand. They believed they weren't just managing risk, they had conquered it. They had created a perfect money-making machine. But in reality, they were building what legendary investor Warren Buffett would later call financial weapons of mass destruction. To understand the 2008 collapse, we must bravely look inside this complex machine and decode its parts. It all started with the foundation of the bubble, subprime mortgages. As housing prices rose, banks had lent as much as they could to people with good credit. To continue making profits, they needed new borrowers. And they turned to a group they had previously always rejected. People with bad credit histories, unstable incomes, or no ability to make a down payment. They created tempting loans, often called 228's AR-MEZ or ninja loans. Borrowers might not need to put any money down and would enjoy a very low teaser interest rate for the first 2 years. The mortgage broker told them, "Don't worry, after 2 years, your house price will have gone up. You can refinance or sell the house for a profit." Millions jumped in, signing contracts they didn't really understand to pursue the American dream, but it was a dream built on a lie. The foundation of the entire global financial system was being built on quicksand. The banks making subprime loans knew they were holding ticking time bombs. They didn't want to keep them. And this is where the financial wizards on Wall Street came in. They invented a process called securitization. Imagine it like a financial sausage factory. Investment banks would buy up thousands of these mortgages. Good loans, mediocre loans, and lots of terrible subprime loans, and throw them all into a giant grinder. They minced them all together, mixing up the risk, and then packaged them into a new product called a mortgage-backed security. The idea was that while a few subprime borrowers might default, it was impossible for all thousands of them to default at the same time. Therefore, the MBS product was considered safe. They sold these sausages to investors all over the world. Pension funds in California, banks in Germany, insurance companies in London. Everyone wanted a piece of the lucrative US real estate market. But the story gets even crazier. Within each MBS sausage, there were still parts that were considered the riskiest. What did Wall Street do with these leftovers? They didn't throw them away. They collected the riskiest pieces from hundreds of different MBS sausages, put them into a second grinder, and created a new, even more complex product called a collateralized debt obligation. This was truly an act of financial alchemy. They took the most toxic financial garbage, repackaged it, and by some magic, declared that most of this new product was perfectly safe. It's like collecting trash from many different bins, putting it in a beautiful box, and selling it as a premium gift. How could Wall Street sell these toxic products? They needed a seal of approval. They got it from the credit rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's. These agencies, which were paid millions of dollars by the very banks they were rating, generously stamped AAA, the highest safety rating, on billions of dollars of CDO products. This AAA stamp told the world that investing in these CDOs was as safe as investing in US Treasury bonds. It was a systemic lie. To make the system seem even safer, Wall Street created a type of insurance policy called a credit default swap. Investors could buy CDSS to insure their MBS and CDO investments. The problem was that giant companies like AIG sold trillions of dollars of this insurance, without having enough capital to pay out if disaster actually struck. It was like one person selling fire insurance for every house in a city without having a penny to their name. The entire system had become a giant casino built on complexity, a lack of transparency, and a blind faith that housing prices would never fall. In 2007, the party began to wind down. The teaser interest rates on subprime loans started to reset to much higher levels. Borrowers couldn't afford the payments. A wave of defaults began. Housing prices, which had been inflated by cheap money and speculation, finally peaked and began to fall. As borrowers defaulted, the MBS and CDO sausages started to stink. God! Investors around the world suddenly realized they were holding worthless assets. But no one knew exactly who was holding how much. Trust, the invisible glue, evaporated. Banks stopped lending to each other. The entire global credit system began to freeze. In 2008, the crisis escalated. In March, the investment bank Bear Stearns collapsed and was rescued by the government at the last minute. That summer, the government had to nationalize the two mortgage giants, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But the fateful event, the giant domino that brought everything down, happened on a weekend in September. The investment bank Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old icon of Wall Street, was on its deathbed. They had bet too heavily on real estate and toxic products. On the weekend of September 13th to 14th, 2008, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson and Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke summoned all the CEOs of the largest banks to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in a desperate attempt to find a buyer for Lehman. But no one wanted to buy a pile of toxic assets. Negotiations failed. The US government, after having rescued Bear Stearns, Fannie, and Freddie, decided it had to draw a line. They wanted to teach the market a lesson about moral hazard, that not everyone would be bailed out. They made a fateful decision to let Lehman Brothers fail. In the early hours of Monday, September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. was the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. In that moment, a tsunami swept through the global financial system. The last vestiges of trust were shattered. If Lehman could fail, anyone could. The global financial system went into cardiac arrest. The consequences of Lehman's collapse were immediate and devastating. Global credit markets froze completely. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged. The panic from the U.S. spread to Europe and Asia, where banks had invested heavily in American products. This was no longer an American crisis. It had become the global Great Recession. The price paid by ordinary people was immense. Millions of Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. The unemployment rate soared to 10%. Pension funds and people's life savings were wiped out. Just days after letting Lehman fail, the U.S. government realized its terrible mistake. The collapse didn't teach the market a lesson. It nearly destroyed the entire market. To prevent a complete meltdown, the government was forced to launch a $700 billion emergency bailout package to rescue the remaining banks, including AIG, the company that had sold the worthless insurance policies. This led to deep social resentment. The image of bankers, who had caused the crisis with their greed and recklessness, receiving multi-million-dollar bonuses and being bailed out with taxpayer money, while millions of ordinary people lost their homes and jobs, created a profound sense of injustice. This rage fueled protest movements like Occupy Wall Street with its famous slogan, "We are the 99%, reflecting the deep divide between the financial elite and the rest of society. The 2008 crisis was a near-death experience for global capitalism. It left behind painful lessons. Too big to fail is a serious problem. When banks believe they will always be rescued by the government, they are incentivized to take insane risks. Complexity hides risk. Complex and opaque financial instruments were used to conceal enormous risks. The lesson was the need for much greater transparency and stricter oversight of financial products, leading to reforms like the Dodd-Frank Act. Greed can be packaged in mathematical formulas, but it can't be hidden forever. Crisis exposed the hubris of an industry that believed it could eliminate risk with computer models, when in fact it was only amplifying it. It was not just a market failure, it was also a moral failure. 2008 changed the game. We have patched up the system, but the monster of greed and systemic risk has never been completely vanquished. The ghost of 2008 has not yet truly been exorcised. We have walked through the darkest valleys of 20th century financial history, but the machine is still running. New cracks are forming where we least expect them. In our final part, we will look to the present and future to ask, where's the ghost of the next crisis hiding? A question for you after this part. Do you think the bankers who caused the 2008 crisis should have been criminally prosecuted? Why were so few held accountable? The ghost of the future. The ticking time bombs of the 21st century. After the storm of 2008, the world held its breath. Governments and central banks unleashed massive bailout packages and enacted thousands of pages of new regulations like the Dodd-Frank Act in the U.S. A sense of calm, albeit a cautious one, returned. We told ourselves we had learned our lesson, that we had made the system safer. But history has an ironic habit of repeating itself, albeit in a different guise. Have we really cured the disease, or are we just treating the symptoms? Has the ghost in the machine, the core nature of the boom and bust cycle, simply moved to a different room, a place we aren't watching? When we look back at all the stories we've covered, from tulip bulbs to subprime mortgages, we see hauntingly familiar common denominators. The greed for a free lunch, the reliance on ever-growing mountains of debt, and the illusion of safety that this time is different. These factors are the constants in the equation of collapse. Only the variables change. The technology, the types of assets, and the stories we tell ourselves. So, in the world of the 21st century, what are those new variables? Where are the time bombs of our era being set? The first and perhaps largest bomb lies in the safest of places, in government treasuries. Remember how we escaped the 2008 crisis? Governments around the world borrowed and spent trillions of dollars to save banks and stimulate their economies. Then, over a decade later, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and they once again opened the money taps, borrowing on an unprecedented scale to support people and businesses. These actions may have been necessary, but they have left a huge and worrying legacy. Global public debt is at a record high. The world's largest nations, including the US, Japan, and many European countries, are drowning in a sea of debt. Let's try to picture this with a family analogy. Imagine a family that maxed out their credit cards to fix a leaky roof. Then a few years later, they maxed them out again to pay for an emergency medical procedure. Now, they are living on borrowed time. Their income is just enough to cover the monthly interest payments, and they constantly have to take out new loans just to pay off old ones. That is the situation of many governments today. For more than a decade of near-zero interest rates, carrying these massive debts seemed manageable. But what happens when inflation forces central banks to raise interest rates? The cost of servicing this debt will skyrocket, pushing national budgets to their limits. At that point, governments will face terrible choices: default, declare they cannot repay their debts. This would cause a crisis of confidence in the global financial system, potentially collapsing the bond market and causing a catastrophe even larger than the fall of Lehman Brothers. Harsh austerity drastically cut essential public services like healthcare, education, and social security. This could lead to severe social and political unrest. Print more money. Force the central bank to print money to pay the debt. This is the path to hyperinflation, destroying the value of the currency and people's savings. The too big to fail problem of 2008 was about banks. Problem of the future may be about countries. What happens if investors lose faith in the US government's ability to repay its debt? Where will the entire global financial system, built on the safety of US Treasury bonds, go? This public debt bomb is quietly ticking, and we don't know exactly when it will go off. While the traditional financial system is buckling under the weight of debt, a new parallel and ambitious financial world has emerged. It is the world of cryptocurrency and stablecoins. The philosophy behind the birth of Bitcoin and the crypto world is a powerful one to create a decentralized financial system. Free from the control of greedy banks or incompetent governments, it promises a future where you can be your own bank, where transactions are transparent and cannot be interfered with. But alongside that ideal, another reality has unfolded. The crypto world has quickly become a giant global casino. Stories of people becoming millionaires overnight from Bitcoin, Dogecoin, or Shiba Inu have attracted millions of new investors. A frenzied mania, fueled by FOMO and social media, has taken place. This strangely echoes the manias of the past. Could this be a hidden bubble? A high-tech version of the Tulip mania? Let's consider the characteristics. Vague intrinsic value. For many cryptocurrencies, their value doesn't come from any practical application or cash flow. Their value comes from the narrative, from the belief that someone else will be willing to pay a higher price for it in the future. This is the classic definition of a bubble asset: controlled leverage. Crypto exchanges, largely operating outside the bounds of traditional financial law, allow users to trade with extreme leverage. This amplifies volatility and turns investing into an all-or-nothing gamble, just like buying on margin in the 1920s. Lack of regulation. The crypto Wild West is rife with scams, billion-dollar hacks, and blatant market manipulation. The collapse of giant exchanges like FTX or unstable stablecoins like Terra Luna are prime examples. Each of these collapses is like a miniature financial crisis, exposing the fragility of a system built more on promises than on solid rules. For a long time, many thought a crypto collapse would not affect the traditional financial system. But that line is becoming increasingly blurred. Major banks, hedge funds, and corporations are gradually entering this market. If a massive crypto bubble were to truly burst, it wouldn't just wipe out the assets of individual investors. Its shockwaves could very well spread to the traditional financial markets, causing a new credit and confidence crisis. The third bomb is not in a specific asset class, but in the very operational structure of modern markets. Today, the majority of trades on Wall Street are no longer executed by humans. They're executed by machines. Algorithmic trading an artificial intelligence that can process information and execute millions of buy and sell orders in a millisecond. These machines are designed to be extremely efficient. But they also introduce a new and frightening risk: the danger of uncontrollable feedback loops. Imagine thousands of algorithms programmed by different companies with different strategies, all operating in the same market. One algorithm, perhaps, due to a misread news headline, starts selling a large block of stock. Other algorithms, programmed to detect trends, see this large sell order and also begin selling to avoid losses. This creates a self-reinforcing death spiral, causing prices to plummet at a speed that humans cannot possibly react to. This is not science fiction. It has already happened. On May 6, 2010, the US stock market experienced an event known as the flash crash. In just a matter of minutes, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost nearly 1,000 points, equivalent to almost 9% of its value. For no apparent reason, before mysteriously recovering, trillions of dollars in value evaporated and reappeared in an instant. The subsequent investigation indicated that the event was triggered by the actions of a single algorithm. It was a warning. As AI becomes more sophisticated, capable of self-learning and controlling more trading decisions, the risk of a much larger scale flash crash also increases. What happens if one day, a superintelligent AI, for some reason, in its own logic, decides that the best way to optimize profits is to sell off everything? A crisis could unfold at the speed of light, before any human operator could understand what was happening and pull the plug. We have looked at 3 potential ticking time bombs: public debt, crypto speculation, and algorithmic trading. On the surface, they may seem different, but deep down, they all share the same DNA as the crises of the past. They are built on debt, driven by herd psychology, and exist in spaces where the illusion of safety masks underlying risks. This brings us to the final philosophical question, the core question of this entire journey. If crises are an inherent part of the system's nature, can humans ever truly avoid them? Or can we only learn to live with them? Is the cycle of boom and bust simply an ineradicable feature of capitalism, driven by the unchanging human emotions of greed and fear? Are we doomed to repeat these mistakes forever, just with new technologies and new names for the bubbles? Perhaps the answer is not one of absolute pessimism. Perhaps the goal is not to eliminate crises entirely. That may be an impossible task. Perhaps the goal is to build more resilient systems. It's like building cities in an earthquake zone. Cannot stop the ground from shaking, but we can design buildings that can bend without breaking, that can absorb the shocks. Perhaps our goal is to learn to manage crises better, to minimize their damage, and most importantly, to build safety nets to protect the most vulnerable when the inevitable storm hits. Our journey through the darkest chapters of financial history is coming to an end. We have gone from tulip bulbs to AI algorithms. Before we reach the final conclusions, let's take a moment to reflect. If this video has given you even one new perspective, please share it with those you care about.
You've crossed the story. You felt every pulse in the dark, and I was there with you, quietly, always. That's why I left behind one last thing. Not to explain, not to impress, just to stay with you a little longer. A song I chose with care, as if tucking you in from across time and space. So go on, lay back, the music knows where to take you. you're still here, then you're something rare. Not many stay this long. So, thank you for choosing to stay. I'm here too, still awake, surrounded by the quiet glow of my editing screen, shaping the next stories just for you. If there's anything you want to leave behind, a whisper, a suggestion, even just a symbol, drop it in the comments. Because maybe, tomorrow night, you'll hear yourself echoed in a story that's never been told before. still here, even now? I have a feeling part of you is still wandering somewhere between wakefulness and dreaming. I know that feeling well because I'm still awake with you. In a quiet room, I'm gently laying out layers of sound, each breath, each beat, preparing the next journey we'll take together. If you're still listening, leave me a sign. Let me know how you're feeling or just where you are in this vast world. Because right now, in this stillness, you are not alone. You're still there, aren't you? I can't see you, but I can feel you. Like a soft signal pulsing across the silence. Over here, I'm still working, refining layers of sound, rewriting fragments of voice, building the landscape for our next adventure. One that you might inspire. If an idea comes to you, share it with me. Comment below. A theme, a memory, a strange dream. I read every word because I never tell these stories alone. I tell them with you.